I have told this story only once, to my brother Aldrich, on the night he found me standing in the entrance hall of Velmarch in the dark with her traveling trunk at my feet and no clear account of why I had stopped it from being loaded onto the coach. He listened and said nothing for a long moment and then said, "You really are the most stubborn man in England." I took that as a compliment. He meant it as one. But it is not entirely accurate because the stubbornness he admired that evening was not mine. It was hers. And it is her story as much as it is mine, though I am the only one she has permitted to tell it, so I will try to do it justice. I was in those days the most feared man in the northern counties. I say that not with pride, only with the particular detachment of a man describing a reputation he built deliberately, the way a stonemason builds a wall because a wall keeps things out. I had inherited Velmarch at 22, when my father died of a fever that took him in 4 days and left me with 600 acres, a household of 42, debts of my own, modest ones, cleared in 2 years, and a name that northern society both courted and feared. I worked. That is the most honest account I can give of those years. I rose before the household. I read every ledger, every yield record, every tenancy agreement going back 20 years. I attended every sitting of every local tribunal that required a duke's presence, and I attended several that did not. I inspected the pastures in autumn and the drainage works in spring and the harvest accounts before anyone else had thought to sit down with them. I was not cruel. I was, however, very cold, and I had cultivated the coldness the way other men cultivate charm, because charm asks to be liked and I did not require it. I required efficiency, loyalty, and quiet. Velmarch Hall gave me all three. What it did not give me, and what I had not noticed the absence of until the absence was addressed, was anyone who looked at me plainly. Not with the careful admiration of those who want something from a powerful man, and not with the wary distance of those who fear him, but simply, plainly, as one person looks at another. I remember standing at the window of my study on the evening the hired coach came up the long gravel drive. I was not watching for it. I had been reviewing the winter accounts, which were thorough and correct and thoroughly dull, and I heard the wheels on the gravel and looked up because sound in the November stillness at Velmarch carries far. My solicitor Crane had arranged everything. 3 weeks prior he had sent a letter that read in its most essential parts, "The matter of the Voss debt is resolved. You will receive a daughter. Her name is Ilara. She is 24, no encumbrances. The terms are enclosed." The terms were a marriage contract, drawn under the provisions of the Voss family's remaining assets, which amounted to a mortgaged townhouse in the city and a dining set of moderate value. I had not wanted a wife. I had never particularly wanted anything that I had not also needed. I needed heirs, in the eventual way that all dukes need heirs, and I had considered the matter abstractly for several years. The way one considers the eventual necessity of a new roof, necessary and manageable, and not presently urgent. Then the coach door opened and she stepped out, and nothing that followed was abstract. She was not what I expected. I cannot tell you precisely what I expected, because I had not thought about it closely enough to form an image. A debtor's daughter delivered as settlement of a financial arrangement did not, in my experience, arrive with dignity. She arrived, in the 2 cases I had witnessed in my father's time, in tears, or in a visible effort to suppress them, or in a hard, bright anger that was, in its own way, a form of grief. What she did not arrive in was this: a plain dark traveling dress that was clean and carefully pressed despite 2 days on the road, with her dark hair put up neatly and her chin level and her eyes. Even from the upper window I registered this, or I think now that I must have, because I certainly registered it closely in the minutes that followed, entirely calm. My steward Perrin met her on the steps. I watched him bow. I watched her respond with a nod and say something to him. Whatever she said, it produced a small, professional smile from Perrin, who was not a man given easily to smiling, and then she turned and looked at the house, not at the windows, At the house itself, at the stone, at the height of it, at the way the last cold autumn light fell across the west face and threw the old mullioned windows into relief. She looked, in a word, curious, not frightened, not brittle with the effort of not showing fear. She looked like a woman considering a piece of architecture that interested her, and deciding that it did. I went downstairs. Perrin introduced us in the entrance hall. She turned at the sound of my boot on the stone floor and met my eyes immediately, and the steadiness of it was the first thing that unsettled me, though I would not have admitted it for some days. I was accustomed to people who, when they met me for the first time, looked away first, not out of rudeness, out of the involuntary instinct of those who encounter a power they have not prepared for. She looked at me the way she had looked at the house, as if I were interesting. "Miss Voss," I said. I had more prepared. She spoke first. "Your Grace," a correct curtsy, composed and unhurried. "I hope the journey has not caused any inconvenience. I believe the arrangement with your solicitor indicated I would arrive before darkness, and I am slightly behind it. The road past the third post house was worse than expected. I apologize for the delay." She was apologizing for the road. I said, "The road is not your concern." "No," she agreed pleasantly, "but the hour is. I won't take more of your evening than necessary. If someone could show me to wherever I'm to be settled, I expect I'll be more useful to you after I've slept." She looked at Perrin, who looked at me, and I made the gesture that for 30 years no member of my household had ever needed me to explain, and Perrin took her upstairs. I stood in the entrance hall for a moment after the sound of her footsteps receded on the stone stair. Then I went back to my study and sat down and opened the winter accounts and read the same column of figures 4 times without recording any of them. She had said she would be more useful after she had slept. Useful? I was not certain any woman had ever applied that word to herself, in my hearing, in the context of arriving at a duke's estate as its intended mistress, not under these circumstances. I turned it over in my mind for a while, the plainness of it, the complete absence of any appeal to my sympathy or my duty or my sense of what was owed her. And then I poured a small measure of whiskey and went back to the accounts and did not quite read them until 10:30, when I gave up and went to bed. I did not sleep well. I told myself I was thinking about the winter accounts. In the morning she was already in the breakfast room when I came down, which had not happened in this house since my mother's time. The household rose early. I required it, but guests, in my experience, descended at mid-morning and required a great deal of attendance. She was sitting with a cup of tea and a letter she was composing, her pen moving in a small economical hand, and when I entered she looked up, set the pen down without haste, and said good morning with exactly the same composure she had produced the evening before. I said good morning and sat at the head of the table. My footman Grantley appeared with the usual things, and I noticed, without making a show of noticing, that he had already brought her what she required, which meant she had spoken to him before I came down, which meant she had found the kitchen passage without being shown. "You are an early riser," I said. "I have always worked," she said. "Sleeping late is a habit I never had the occasion to form." "You will not be working here," I said, which was what I intended to convey, that she was to be the Duchess of Velmarch, not one of the household staff. She looked at me with those level eyes. "I meant in the general sense, Your Grace. I think poorly when I am idle and worse when I am coddled. I would rather have something to do with my hands and my mind." There was a brief pause. Perrin set down the toast rack with the carefully maintained blankness of a man who is very interested in a conversation and very determined not to appear to be. "I have been given to understand," I said, "that the late Mrs. Hartland managed the household accounts." "For 5 years," said Perrin, "before her retirement. Since then they have been managed between my office and Mr. Crane's in a somewhat—" He stopped. "Distributed manner," I said. "I was going to say that." You were going to say something more charitable, I said. You may say chaotic, it will not offend me. She was watching this exchange with the faint shadow of something, not quite amusement, but in the neighborhood of it. She picked up her tea. If it would be useful, she said, in a tone that was neither an offer nor a request but simply a statement of availability, I could look at them. I have some experience with domestic accounts in a reduced household. I would know what to look for. I regarded her for a moment longer than I typically regard anyone. Then I said, after breakfast. The household accounts occupied 3 ledgers and a supplementary journal, and were, as I had indicated, not so much wrong as inconsistent in method. 2 different hands across 3 years, 2 different systems of categorization, and a gap in the middle 18 months where Crane's office had filled in with a third system entirely. The picture was technically complete and practically illegible. I had been meaning to address it for 2 years. The matter required someone with both the patience and the skill for it, and I had not found that person. She sat with the ledgers in the small parlor off the west corridor for 3 hours that first morning. I was in and out of the main study. The estate produces its demands regardless of domestic arrangements, and I passed the parlor door twice without looking in, which I was quite deliberate about. The third time, I stopped in the doorway. She had her head down, her pen moving at a measured pace, and 3 books open simultaneously on the low table. She had produced a set of marginal notations in a hand I could read from the doorway, small, consistent, precise, cross-referencing the inconsistencies between the 3 methods with a quiet methodical thoroughness that I recognized immediately as the mark of someone who had been doing this under conditions of real pressure for a long time. Not practicing the skill, exercising it. She looked up. She did not seem startled. Your linen costs are inflated, she said. Someone has been charging you for Irish linen and delivering Lancashire. Not by a great deal. The difference per order is small enough to disappear in a larger ledger. But across 3 years, she checked the margin, where she had already done the arithmetic. It amounts to £41, 4 shillings. I said very quietly, which supplier? She told me. I summoned Perrin. The supplier in question was addressed that same afternoon by letter, not by me, which would have made too much of it, but by Perrin, in the calm tone of a man conveying that the matter has been noticed, and that the relationship will not be continued. The supplier responded with an apology and a refund drawn on his account before the week was out. £41 was not a material sum to the Velmarch estate. It was an entirely material sum to Alara Voss, who had spent the previous 4 years managing what remained of her family's household on an income that would have appalled most women I had encountered in society, and who had found the £41 in 3 hours on her first morning here because she knew exactly where to look. She did not tell me any of this directly. I assembled it over time, from small things she said and several she did not say, and from one letter she wrote to her mother in Wiltshire which she sealed before I could read it, but which she mentioned had contained the phrase, "It is a serious house, but the larder is well stocked, and I am warm." A serious house. I held that phrase alongside useful and thought about both of them. The second week passed. The third began. I am not, by inclination, a man who attends to domestic detail unless it impinges on the function of the estate. I had not, in the 6 years since inheriting Velmarch, noticed that the east corridor had a persistent draft in November because the window casement at the far end had never been properly sealed. No one slept in the east corridor. Alara did, and on the 4th morning I came downstairs to find Perrin in conversation with the head carpenter outside the buttery, and I gathered without asking that the east corridor window was under discussion. I did not ask who had raised the matter. I noticed her noticing things. That is the most accurate way I can put it. She had a quality of attention, the same quality I had identified in that first look in the entrance hall, that was not dramatic or performed, simply very present. She listened when people spoke to her. She listened in a way I had genuinely rarely encountered, not composing her response while the other person finished, but actually receiving what was said and sitting with it for a moment before she replied. That pause between hearing and answering was itself a kind of intelligence, and it gave everything she said the quality of having been arrived at rather than prepared. She extended this quality to me, which was not what I was accustomed to. On the 10th evening, I came late to the dinner table for the first time in recent memory. There had been a dispute over a boundary wall on the eastern pasture, a tiresome and well-worn quarrel between two tenant farmers, complicated by the fact that one was elderly and quite hard of hearing, and convinced that repetition at greater volume would eventually produce agreement. The conversation had taken 3 times as long as it should have, and I had come away from it in the kind of quiet frustration I usually kept to myself. I offered, without particularly deciding to, a brief account of the afternoon. I did not typically explain my schedule to anyone in the household. She listened to all of it, to the boundary wall and the tree that had fallen in the previous winter's storm, and the neighbor's conviction that the fallen trunk had altered the line of demarcation, and the other neighbor's equal conviction that it had not. Then she said, "Is the original boundary marker still in the ground?" I said that it was, half obscured by overgrowth at the edge of the old hedge line, but present. She said, "Then the quarrel is about the tree, not the boundary itself. An old tree fell and shifted what each man believes is the visible line, but the marker is the actual record. If it's still there, the answer already exists. It only needs someone without a stake in the outcome to point to it clearly." I looked at her across the table. "My father had a similar situation," she said, and something in her voice settled, the way a room settles when a fire is lit. "A parcel of land on our eastern property. An elm came down in a winter storm, and the neighbor claimed afterward that the boundary had always run on the other side of it. My father was not well suited to that sort of confrontation, by then. So I found the original estate survey in the bottom of an archive box and brought it to the neighbor myself." And I said, "He was embarrassed," she said. "He gave us a wheel of cheese by way of apology, which was considerably more pleasant than a legal proceeding and only slightly less satisfying." I found I was almost smiling. "The original survey map for the eastern pastures," I said, "is almost certainly in the estate library." She looked up with the alertness of someone who has just been told something useful. "I thought there might be something of that kind there. I saw what looked like archive boxes when I looked in, earlier this week." "You were in the library?" Yes. I hope that wasn't presumptuous. I wasn't certain whether the library was open to me. I said, more sharply than I intended, "Everything in this house is open to you." A brief silence. She held my eyes for a moment with that weighing quality I was beginning to recognize. "Thank you," she said, and went back to her dinner. She found the survey map. She brought it to the eastern pasture the following afternoon with Perrin in attendance. I had insisted on the propriety of it, and she had agreed without comment, which told me she would have gone regardless and was simply being accommodating about the formality. The boundary dispute was resolved before supper. She thanked both men for their patience, Perrin reported, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has served in a house that has been quietly missing something and has just watched it be found. She suggested they share a meal over it rather than a solicitor's bill. I believe they agreed. I said nothing, but I thought about it for some time. The library became hers in the evenings. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I do not want it to sound accidental, as though I simply found myself there each evening because that was where I had always gone, when in fact for the previous 6 years I had gone to the library perhaps twice a month for a specific volume, and otherwise read in the study. It was not accidental. Perrin had mentioned, once in passing, that she spent the evenings there, and I filed the information and went to the library that evening, and she was there, and the conversation that followed lasted until the hall clock struck midnight and she looked up with genuine surprise and said, "Good heavens, I had not noticed the hour. I had noticed it strike 11. I had not moved." We talked about the estate that first evening, and then about the survey maps, and then the conversation opened outward, because she had found a very old volume of county records in the archive, and was reading it with the absorption of a woman who has been rationing her access to good books for some years, and has just discovered a library that runs to several hundred volumes and shows no sign of running out, to a long and unexpectedly lively argument about the third Earl of Casterfeld, who had built an elaborate bridge in 1683. I maintained he had been a man of genuine engineering vision. She maintained he had been a man with gout and enforced inactivity. "Gout does not preclude vision," I said. "Enforced idleness combined with surplus income," she said, with the pleasant precision of someone stating a well-supported position, "accounts for a great many bridges and follies and unusual garden features in the history of this country, and very few of them are the products of genuine vision. The Earl had 4 months of confinement, excellent craftsman, and nothing else requiring his attention. I think that is the more complete explanation." "You are very certain of yourself," I said. "I am very certain of the historical record," she said, and there was something in her voice that was very nearly pleasure. "There is a letter from the Earl's steward in the third archive box, on the left, specifying that he commissioned the bridge during the same winter his physician ordered him to rest. The steward's tone is that of a man who has been asked to manage a large and impractical project because his employer is confined indoors and growing irritable." I looked at her. "You have been in those boxes all afternoon." "I have made a start," she said. "The collection is substantial. Someone appears to have organized it by approximate weight." I laughed. The sound surprised me, rusty, like a hinge that has gone too long without use, but entirely genuine. She looked at me when she heard it, not startled, but with that quality of careful attention, as though she were registering something she intended to remember. We stayed in the library until midnight. The clock struck and she apologized for the hour, which was courteous and unnecessary, and said good night at the library door with the composure she brought to everything. And I stayed in the library after she had gone and sat in the quiet by the dying fire and did not read anything and did not particularly try to. The next evening I was in the library at 7 o'clock. So was she. Neither of us remarked on this. Grantley began leaving a small plate of biscuits on the side table at 7. He did not mention it. I did not address it. Elara ate them with the unself-conscious appreciation of someone who has learned not to make ceremony of small pleasures. And after a week or two, the biscuits were simply part of the evenings, unremarkable and necessary, like the fire. On the evenings when we talked about the estate, the county, the history she was reading her way through with opinion. On the evenings when the estate demanded an early start the next morning, we sat on opposite sides of the fire and read our respective books, and this was equally agreeable, and I thought on several of those evenings that it had been a very long time since I had been comfortable in a room with another person, without needing to manage the situation. I did not need to manage anything with her. She simply was. I understood this most clearly on an evening near the end of the third week, when she set her book down and looked at the fire for a moment and said, without preamble, "May I ask you something?" I said she might. "The eastern tenants, the Morrow family in the second cottage, their roof has been a problem since before last winter. Perrin mentioned it in passing. It was not in the maintenance ledger." "It was not in the maintenance ledger," I said carefully, "because the Morrow family did not report it through the proper channels." "They didn't report it," she said, "because they were worried about the increase to their tenancy terms that came through last spring." A pause. "I am sorry. That is not my concern. I shouldn't have said it." "On the contrary," I said. "You should have." I set my own book aside. "The roof will be addressed next week. I have already spoken to Perrin." She looked at me. You knew. I know most things that happen on this estate, I said. The question is not the roof. The question is why the family felt they could not tell me. People who do not report things to me because they fear the consequence are people I have not given the right kind of assurance, and that is my failure, not theirs. She was very quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. That is a generous way to understand it, she said. It is the accurate way, I said. She looked at me, that particular steady quality of her attention, and then she said something that I have thought about many times since. You are not what I expected. What did you expect? She considered this carefully, the way she considered everything. A wall, she said. I was told you were the most feared man in the northern counties. I expected a wall. There is a wall, I said. Yes, she said, but there are windows in it. I did not know what to say to that. She picked up her book, and the firelight moved on the ceiling, and I sat in the room with her and thought that this was the most truthful thing anyone had said to me in years, and that she had said it as simply as though it were obvious, as though she had simply looked at me and seen it and had no reason not to say so. My brother Aldrich arrived the following week, unannounced, as was his habit. He rode up the drive on a gray gelding in the afternoon, and was in the entrance hall before Perrin had quite processed the sound of hooves on gravel, and he had shaken my hand and given me the brief, pressing embrace that served him for all formal occasions, and looked around the house with the considering air of a man who has visited a place many times and is checking it against his memory. You look different, he said. I look the same, I said. Your study is cleaner, he said. The study is always clean. It is not always tidy, he said, which was true. There is a distinction, and it had been several years since the difference was notable. He said nothing further about it and asked about the horses, which was his usual transition between observations he was not quite ready to press, and I told him about the horses, and we had dinner. Ilara was at the table. Aldrich sat across from her, and within 10 minutes was discussing the drainage situation in the South County, with the animation of a man who had been looking for a good conversation on this subject for some time. Aldrich managed our mother's old property, and had been contending with a particularly difficult clay seam in the lower fields for 2 seasons, and Ilara had thoughts about this, precise, practical thoughts, drawing on something she had read in a pamphlet from an agricultural society in the north, which she described with enough specificity that Aldrich set down his fork. Where did you find that pamphlet? He said. In the 3rd shelf from the top of the east bookcase, she said, behind a collection of sermons that I suspect no one has opened since the previous century. Aldrich looked at me. The library, I said. She found it in your library, he said, with a quality of tone I chose not to address. After dinner, Aldrich and I sat in the study with the whiskey, and he looked at the fire for a while, and then said, with the directness that had always been his most useful quality, "She is not what I expected." No, I said. She is not what anyone expected, he said. I spoke to Perrin when I arrived, and to Grantley, he paused, and to the Morrow family on the way up the East Lane. The son was quite forthcoming about the roof. I said nothing. KLN, he said, which was the particular use of my name that indicated he intended to say something I might prefer he did not. Are you going to let her leave when the contract expires? I looked at the fire. Because if you are, he said, you are a fool, and I say that with great affection and considerable confidence. The contract, I said carefully, contains a 6-month provisional clause. I know what the contract contains, Aldrich said. Crane's office writes the same provision into all of them. I am asking what you intend to do about it. I intend, I said, to consider the matter carefully and make a decision in the appropriate time. Aldrich drank his whiskey. You have been considering things carefully for 11 years, he said, And the result is a very well-managed estate and a study that is tidy when it hadn't been tidy before this month. He set his glass down. Ask her to stay. I will consider it, I said. Ask her to stay, he said again pleasantly. Not because the estate needs her, which it plainly does. Not because it is convenient, which it plainly is. Because you have spent 11 years being the most feared man in the northern counties, and it has made you very efficient and very alone. And this is the first time I have sat at dinner in this house, and heard it sound like a house someone lives in rather than a house someone manages. I said nothing. I'm going to bed, Aldrich said and stood, and put a hand briefly on my shoulder as he passed. Think about it. I thought about it. For the rest of that evening and through most of the night and a substantial portion of the following morning, I thought about it. It was the 4th week when the letter came from my aunt. Lady Marveth Velmarch was my father's elder sister, and she had the particular combination of genuine affection, considerable social ambition on my behalf, and comprehensive northern acquaintance that made her the most effective disseminator of information in 3 counties. She had heard of the arrangement. She wrote that she was coming to dine, and that she was bringing her daughter Cecily and Cecily's very suitable young man, and that she hoped very much I had not settled the matter in too great a hurry without proper consideration. The final paragraph speculated at some length about the suitability of a debtor's daughter for the position of Duchess of Velmarch. I expected 2 hours of managed ordeal. I showed the letter to Alara over breakfast. She read it in full, set it down, looked at her tea. Your aunt believes you have made a mistake, she said. My aunt believes every decision I have made since the age of 22 has been made in too great a hurry, I said. She is occasionally correct. More often she is wrong. The dinner will take 2 hours and she will leave having formed a conclusion. I would like that conclusion to be accurate. She looked at me. What would an accurate conclusion look like? Whatever is actually here, I said. She held my eyes for a moment. Then, very well, she said. Lady Marveth arrived on Saturday with Cecily and Cecily's young man Thornton, who was amiable and tall and wisely quiet, and my aunt swept into the entrance hall with the manner of a woman who has dressed carefully for an inspection she expects to conduct. I watched her assess Alara in the first few seconds, the rapid, comprehensive assessment that my aunt had practiced for 50 years in drawing rooms across the county. Alara extended her hand and said, with perfect ease, I have been looking forward to meeting you, Lady Marveth. I read your piece in the Casterfeld Quarterly last spring, the one on Northern Estate Management, and I thought your observations about drainage in clay-heavy soil were very well argued. The 3rd illustration was particularly clear. A very brief silence. Lady Marveth had written that piece under a male pen name. She had not disclosed this to anyone. Alara added pleasantly, I recognize the estate from the description of the Southfield drainage system. It is quite distinctive. I found myself wishing there were more articles of that kind in the Quarterly. It tends toward history rather than practical management, and the practical management is what most people actually need. My aunt stared at her for 3 full seconds, her composure held very nearly. Then she said, Good heavens, child, and took Alara's arm and walked her into the drawing room without a backward glance. Cecily looked at me. I think, she said pleasantly, that Aunt Marveth is about to adopt her. I believe you may be right, I said. The dinner was nothing like what I had steeled myself for. My aunt and Alara sat at my right and spoke across me for most of the first 2 courses about soil chemistry and crop rotation, and the particular challenges of drainage in a wet autumn on northern heavy land, with the enthusiasm of 2 people who have found a subject they both care about, and someone who will take them seriously. Cecily and Thornton ate quietly and exchanged the small, contented smiles of people watching a situation resolve pleasantly. I contributed enough to establish that I was present and listened to the rest. Alara was not performing. That is what I kept returning to, watching her across the candlelight. She was not dressed more finely than any other evening, the same dark gown, the same neatly arranged hair, and she had no studied grace for company, no register she switched to for important guests. She was simply thinking and speaking, and finding my aunt a person worth engaging with seriously, which my aunt appeared to find profoundly refreshing, as though it had been some time since anyone had done her that simple courtesy. When the dinner was over and the carriages brought around, my aunt took my arm in the entrance hall while Ilara said good night to Cecily, and said in a voice pitched for me alone, "She knows her own mind." "Yes," I said. "She is not easily managed." "No." A brief pause. "Good," said Lady Marveth, and went out to her carriage. I stood in the drive until the coach lights disappeared around the turn in the lane, and then went back inside to find Ilara standing at the foot of the staircase, holding a pair of gloves that were not hers. "Your aunt left these," she said. "I'll have them sent tomorrow." She nodded and put her hand on the banister. She was tired. I could see it in the slight set of her shoulders, the way a long evening of holding oneself well eventually settles into the body. "Thank you," I said. She looked at me. For what? I didn't do anything she wouldn't have found out for herself given time. "You knew about the article," I said. "I read widely," she said. "It is the one luxury that requires no money." She looked at me a moment longer. "Good night, Your Grace." She went upstairs. I stood in the entrance hall and listened to the house settle into quiet around me, and then I went to the library and sat in my chair and did not open a book, and I stayed there until the fire burned very low and the room was cold. I thought about a girl managing an impossible household alone on what remained after her father's debts had eaten everything else, and about what it meant that she could say the one luxury that requires no money without any self-pity at all, as though it were simply a plain and ordinary fact about the world. I thought about the cheese. I thought about a girl of 20 finding survey maps in archive boxes and carrying them to the neighbor herself because her father couldn't. I thought about what she had said. There is a wall, but there are windows in it. I thought she deserves better than what she was given. And then I thought quietly, like a bolt sliding into place, I could give her better, if she would let me, if she wanted it. The letter from Crane came 5 weeks after her arrival, on a cold gray Wednesday morning with the Moore running pewter outside the windows. I read it at my desk. Then I read it again. In summary, the Voss debt had been fully discharged under the terms of the original settlement. The marriage contract, as drawn, contained a 6-month provisional clause, standard practice, Crane noted, inserted to protect both parties. And since the debt was now satisfied and no formal ceremony had been solemnized, Miss Voss was legally free to withdraw from the arrangement at her choosing. She would be written to by Crane's office. Any traveling expenses would be settled by the estate, and a reasonable provision would be made for her resettlement. Crane expressed hope that the arrangement had been satisfactorily managed. I set the letter on the desk. I sat very still for a long time, long enough that Perrin came to ask about breakfast and I said not yet, and he withdrew, and I sat in the cold morning light and allowed myself to simply think, which I do not typically do indulgently, because thinking without purpose produces nothing but uncertainty, and uncertainty is not a condition I find useful. This morning I could not stop it. I thought about the household accounts, clean and consistent for the first time in 3 years, about the East Corridor window, sealed at last, about the Morrow family's roof, under repair that very week, about the boundary dispute resolved before supper with an old map and a wheel of cheese, about my aunt's face when Ilara said I recognized the estate from the detail of the South Field system, about the biscuits that Grantley left at 7 without being asked, which Ilara ate without ceremony, which was somehow the thing that moved me. Then I stopped cataloging the household and thought about her, about Ilara, about what it would mean to hear that coach on the gravel drive again and watch the door close behind her and hear the wheels go down the lane and away. I went to find her. She was in the walled garden at the back of the east wing. The frost still lay on the grass, and she was in her old work gloves, cutting back the spent lavender stems with a small knife, working her way along the far bed with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. She heard the gate latch and turned. I had prepared on the walk over a clear and measured account of what I intended to say. What came out, before the preparation had organized itself, was, "The contract has been discharged. Crane's letter came this morning. You are legally free." She looked at me. The cold morning light was very clear and still. She had a bunch of dried lavender in her hands. "I see," she said. "His letter will reach you tomorrow," I said. "But I wanted you to know today, from me, not from a solicitor's office." She was quiet for a moment. She looked down at the lavender. "What does it mean in practical terms?" "It means you may leave," I said. "At any time you choose. The estate will cover your journey, and I will write to Crane about a provision that gives you the means to settle wherever." "I understand what the letter says," she said quietly. "I meant, what does it mean for you?" I stopped. The wind moved along the top of the garden wall. The frost on the grass had begun to lift in the pale morning light. "It means," I said, and then I stopped and started again, which I had not done in a conversation since I was perhaps 17 years old, "that whatever happens from this morning will not be because of a contract." She waited. "I want to be clear," I said. "Then be clear," she said. "In 34 years of managing an estate, a county position, a household, and a great many complicated situations involving other people's interests, I had become reasonably good at saying difficult things plainly. I had planned this conversation on the walk over. And yet I found myself standing in a frost-edged garden in November, looking at a woman who was holding dried lavender, and looking back at me with the direct, uncomplicated quality of attention that was simply, entirely who she was, and everything I had planned set itself in a different order than I had intended. "You came to this house," I said, "because your father's solicitors sent you and mine received you, and neither of us had a meaningful choice in the matter worth the paper it was written on. I know that. I know what it cost you, arriving as you arrived, with your chin level and your eyes open, and the first thing out of your mouth an apology for the road." Something crossed her face, very controlled. "I am not asking you to pretend it was anything other than what it was," I said. "It was a debt, an arrangement. I know that and you know it, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. And I am not going to make a speech about the household accounts, though they are considerably improved because you did not do it for my approval and you do not need it." She said nothing. She was listening fully. "But there is something else," I said, "also true, which is that in 5 weeks I have not felt this house the way it has felt these 5 weeks since I was a boy in it with my mother. I am not speaking of the accounts, or the east window, or the boundary markers, or my aunt's gratifying discovery of a reader for her agricultural essays. I am speaking of the evenings in the library, of the way you listen, which is rarer than you know, of the fact that you can be thoroughly right about a 17th century earl for 40 minutes past midnight without ever making me feel badly for having been wrong, of the way you are with the people in this household, not managing them, but actually seeing them, and what it is to be in a room with you and not need to manage anything at all, which is a feeling I had not known I was missing until I found it." The wind moved. "There is a wall," I said. "You told me there was a wall, you were correct. But you also told me there were windows in it." I looked at her. "You are the windows," I said. The garden was very still. "Ilara," I said, her name plain without title or formality for the first time. She held my eyes. "I am not asking you to stay because the contract says you should," I said. "There is no contract. I am asking because Velmarch is more itself with you in it, and I am more myself, and I did not know that about either of us until 5 weeks ago. And I would rather know it than not, and I would rather you stayed than left, and that is the whole of it." The garden was quiet. The frost caught the pale morning light. "Your Grace," she began. "Kalen," I said. She stopped. "If there is no contract," I said, "then there is no title between us either." A pause. The kind of pause in which a great deal of quiet deciding takes place. Then she said, "Kalen." Just that, my name. In this garden. In the cold morning, with the frost on the stones and the dried lavender in her hands, and nothing at all required of either of us except the truth. I crossed the distance between us, not quickly, not dramatically, simply directly, and stopped when I was close enough that the next step would be a different kind of step altogether. And she did not step back, and she looked up at me with those clear, steady eyes, and I said, "Tell me what you want. Not what you have agreed to. What you want." A pause. "I want," she said, "to find the rest of the Earl's correspondence. There are 2 archive boxes I haven't opened, and I suspect the answer about the bridge is in them." I looked at her. "That is not an answer," I said. "It is a beginning of one," she said. And then she smiled, not the controlled, not quite amusement I had been watching for 5 weeks, but fully, entirely, the smile of a woman who has decided something and is at peace with it, warm and dry and completely her own. "I would like to stay," she said, "if you are asking." "I am asking," I said. She held out the lavender. I took it. I took her hand with it, both of mine around hers, and she let me. And the garden was very still, and the frost on the grass was lifting in the morning light. And I thought that I had been the most feared man in the northern counties for the better part of a decade, and had not, until this moment, understood that the wall I had built with such care was protecting me from exactly this. The possibility of being known. Fully, without contract or arrangement or the management of impressions. The way she had looked at me in the entrance hall on the very first evening. The way she listened. The way she had just said my name in this garden with nothing required and nothing performed, and the dried lavender between our hands. She knew me. In 5 weeks among ledgers and survey maps and archived letters and evenings past midnight by the library fire, she had learned the shape of me, not the Duke who managed everything and required nothing, but the man who stood in the entrance hall listening to footsteps recede on the stone stairs and sat for an hour unable to read a column of winter accounts. And she was still here, still clear-eyed, looking up at me in the garden with the frost on her boots. I thought of what Aldrich had said the week before. "This is the first time I have sat at dinner in this house and heard it sound like a house someone lives in." I had told him I would think about it. I had thought about it. I had thought about it for 7 days and come to the walled garden with a letter in my coat pocket that could have taken everything away. And instead of letting it, I had crossed the frost-tipped grass and asked her to tell me what she wanted. She had told me. And the thing that undid me most, standing there with the lavender between our hands and the cold November morning very still around us, was not the word she said, not yes, or "I would like to stay," or even my name in her voice in the garden. It was the simplicity of the moment itself. There were no observers. There was no arrangement left to be managed. There was nothing between us except the truth of what we each were, and she had looked at it plainly and found it sufficient and said so. I thought, this is what it is to be seen. Not performed for, not managed at a careful distance, not feared. Seen, the way she saw the Morrow family's roof, the way she saw the £41 hidden in 3 years of linen invoices, the way she saw a window in a wall and thought it worth mentioning. With that complete and unfussy attention, as though seeing clearly were simply the obvious thing to do with one's eyes. I had spent a great many years being expert at not being seen. The reputation, the coldness, the wall, I had built them all with deliberate care, for reasons that had seemed to me sound, and they had served. They had kept Velmarch running, and they had kept me upright through a decade of solitary management, and they had ensured that no one asked me for anything I could not straightforwardly give. They had also, as I was only now beginning to understand, ensured that no one gave me anything I could not straightforwardly categorize. She had given me something I could not categorize. She had given me evenings in a library. She had given me the sound of her laughing at a 17th-century steward's complaint about his gout-ridden employer. She had given me a household that felt like a household rather than an inventory. She had said, in a walled garden on a cold November morning, with complete composure and no sentiment that was not entirely earned, "I would like to stay." I held her hand and thought, I will not waste this. The weeks between the garden and the chapel were the strangest and the quietest of my life. Strange, because for the first time in the life of this house, we were a house in which something was openly understood between two people who had not said it aloud in any of its fullness. And yet everything was quietly different. The evenings in the library, which had always been comfortable, were now something other than comfortable, something warmer and more particular, with an awareness in them that was not awkward but was very present. She would look up from her reading and find me watching her, and she would hold my eyes for a moment with the plain directness that was simply her nature, and then she would go back to her book, and the fire would crackle, and the house would settle around us, and I would think, "This is real," and I would think, "She is staying." Quiet, because we were both people who moved through life with a degree of deliberate economy, who did not require constant statement of things already understood, who found comfort in the orderly movement of days that held both work and rest and good company in the evenings. We did not make speeches to each other about what had changed. We simply lived in it together, and the household observed and adjusted, and Grantley continued to leave the biscuits at 7. And Perrin walked about with a quality of satisfaction that he was too professional to express and too human to fully conceal. We were married in the chapel at Velmarch 3 weeks later. A small ceremony. My brother Aldrich, who wept with the cheerful openness that has always been his most endearing quality, and who claimed afterward that it was the cold air. Perrin and Grantley and the senior members of the household, who attended with the quiet satisfaction of people whose house has been made whole again. My Aunt Marveth, who arrived 40 minutes early and spent 20 of them adjusting Alara's hair, and was overheard assuring Cecily that she had known from the very first evening, which was not precisely accurate but which I did not contest. And Alara's mother, the elder Mrs. Voss, who came up from Wiltshire on the mail coach and looked at me for a very long time before she said anything at all, and then said, "You had better be worthy of her. I have taken that as the most generous and demanding compliment of my adult life, and I have been working on it ever since." I said her name in the chapel and she said mine, and the candles were very clear on the old stone, and Aldrich wept without any serious attempt at concealment. And what I remember most is the way she looked at me when it was done. Not with the relief of someone granted a reprieve, not with the gratitude of someone rescued from a difficult situation by the goodwill of a powerful man. With the same plain, clear attention she had brought to everything in this house from the first evening, as if I were someone worth looking at, and she had decided, of her own free will, to look. I have spent 31 years trying to deserve that look. I do not always succeed. She will tell you I am still too given to silence, too quick to settle into solitude, too likely to let a question go too long unanswered when I should simply say the thing outright. She is correct on all 3 points. I have not substantially reformed on any of them, which she accepts with a patience I have never fully deserved, and have attempted to earn back at various intervals with things I thought might please her. The survey map for the Southfield drainage she had wanted for the spring plans, a comprehensive new set of archival boxes for the East Wing collection, commissioned from a firm in the city without mentioning it until they arrived. And on one occasion I remember with particular satisfaction, a detailed scholarly account of the 3rd Earl of Casterfeld's bridge, commissioned at considerable expense from the County Historical Society, for the sole and stated purpose of establishing, once and for all, that the man had been a visionary. She read it in the library in the armchair by the fire that has been hers for 31 years, on a winter evening much like the ones we spent in those first 5 weeks. She read it beginning to end without comment. She set it down. She looked at me over the fire. "It mentions the gout," she said. "It also documents 14 design innovations that were not standard practice until 30 years after the bridge was built," I said, "which is, by any definition, vision." She considered this at length, with the seriousness it deserved. "Vision," she said at last, "complicated by circumstances." "As agreed," I said, 30 years ago." She smiled. The same smile she had given me in the garden that morning with the frost on the stones, warm and dry and entirely her own, and she reached across the arm of her chair and placed her hand on mine, which is what she does when she is pleased with something and finds no need to say more about it. Which is, I have come to understand, the most eloquent thing she does. That is the whole of it. A debt, a contract, a coach on a gravel drive on a November evening, and a woman who stepped out of it in a plain, dark dress and looked at the stone house with curiosity and at me the same way, and said she expected to be more useful to me after she had slept. She was useful. I want to be precise about what I mean. Not useful in only the narrow sense of the accounts and the archive and the boundary disputes, and the 6 articles she has now published in the Casterfeld Quarterly, under her own name, because I told her in the 2nd year of our marriage that she was not to do otherwise. And she looked at me when I said it with an expression that told me she had been waiting a long time for someone to say exactly that, and the look cost me rather more than I expected. I mean useful in the way she meant it on that first morning, present, capable, and genuinely engaged with the work of living, which is rarer than the practical sort and considerably more valuable. She made this house useful to itself again. She made me useful to the people in my care, to her, to whatever part of myself had been running on duty and discipline and cold efficiency for 6 years before a coach came up the gravel drive, and a woman stepped out of it and looked at the stone house as though it were interesting, and then looked at me the same way. She came to Velmarch as a settlement of a debt. She stayed as a choice, and she has been choosing every morning for 31 years in the library, in the walled garden, in the small parlor off the west corridor where she still does her best thinking, in the chapel where I said her name, and she said mine, and neither of us was bound to be there by anything except our own decision to remain, freely, because she wants to be here. I did not, standing at the study window on that November evening watching the coach door open, expect to want her to stay. I cannot now conceive of what wanting anything else would feel like.